Welcome to the Owl's Nest, everyone. My name is Ryan, and I'm very fortunate to be your host for today's episode. The topic for this episode is enabling supply chain planning with cloud-based technologies, and my guests, Martha Limatete and DC Sfargola, are not only experts in their field, but they share an unending passion for cross-functional planning alignment. In this episode, Martha and DC join me to discuss considerations for a successful digital transformation, the preparation required before purchasing a cloud-based system, and the importance of involving your current supply base as a company digitalizes their supply chain. Sit back and enjoy. Big welcome to today's Owl's Nest podcast. I'm very excited for today's discussion. Our topic is enabling supply chain planning with cloud-based technologies. And I couldn't have more applicable guests than Martha Limatete and DC Sfargola. Martha is well-versed in IT procurement, sourcing, and operations, having worked in various industries. She has more than 15 years of experience in IT and procurement sourcing. Martha is an expert in partnering with IT patterns. Martha works for Southwest Airlines as supply chain tech business partner and has held progressive executive roles at Atos, Accenture, and Sabre. And she has expertise in procurement transformation, strategic sourcing, contract management, negotiation, and vendor management. DC has spent the early part of her career in digital and experiential marketing before transitioning to supply chain. She's currently a consultant focused on connected planning, process improvement, and leveraging cloud-based technology to achieve supply chain excellence. Martha and DC, it's great to have you here for today's podcast, and welcome to the Owl's Nest.
Thank you very much, Ryan. Happy to be here and looking forward to an incredible discussion with DC and with you as well.
Absolutely. I echo those exact same sentiments. Super excited.
Perfect. Let's get going. So we'll start with you, DC. Mm-hmm. Simply put, when a company makes the decision to start enabling planning with cloud-based technologies, how do they get started?
Well, the first thing that I would like to see companies do that I don't think is happening as much right now, and I'd definitely be very interested to hear Martha's perspective and experiences this as well, being in industry and also having been in consulting, is that companies should start at the process definition. So defining the process that the technology is going to support and reviewing data to make sure that any data that's going to be used by the technology, consumed by the technology, any systems that need to be integrated with the new tool are all good to go. So what I've seen very often over the past couple of years that digital transformation and digital tools has been so top of mind in the forefront of supply chain leaders is this desire to get the tool implemented fast and to realize value and ROI very quickly. And in so doing, a lot of the soft steps, I like to call them, kind of, aligned with soft skills, the people part of it, the process part of it, it's kind of overlooked. And technology itself doesn't solve whatever issue. It doesn't help with whatever pain point you're experiencing in your supply chain. The technology supports a process. It supports people. But if the process is not in place, then the technology is going to, I don't want to use the word fail, but it's likely not going to be adopted by users. It's likely going to end up being, kind of a big write-off financially for the company since people aren't using it. So the company isn't realizing the value from the technology. I definitely say to align process first amongst all the stakeholders that would be involved in the effects that come from the technology implementation, and to make sure the data is clean and ready to go, because that's a very big holdup for a lot of these implementations, is that the data just isn't ready. Or even once the tool is implemented and the data starts flowing through the system, then there is a realization at that point that, oh, this isn't really calculating the way that I expected it to calculate. Even though my formula is correct, my base data is way off. So let us go back to the source systems. Let us go back to IT and figure it out. And that takes weeks, sometimes months, whereas your tool is sitting here unused that you've implemented while you're trying to figure that out. So I don't know, Martha, have you experienced the same thing?
Yeah, I definitely agree with you completely that the data that goes into the solution that the companies are acquiring is so critical, and the processes have to be defined. So I mean, I would say that companies definitely need to understand and evaluate how they operate in terms of both their external and internal operations. Because once you know what that looks like and you know what the processes look like from both perspectives, then when your departure to digitalization becomes so much easier because you can make it a priority and you've been able to dedicate the right resources. You know who your leaders are that are going to support that. You know what the user experience is with the current solutioning before you are able to begin the whole entire process of digitalization. So I think that would, from my point of view, I would say define what digital transformation means to organization first. And that is right in line with what DC has just described.
Yes, that's a really good point, Martha, to really define what that transformation means. I think, Ryan, your question was specifically about cloud-based planning tools, and in the context of what does digital transformation mean. Even to that point, where do the cloud-based tools sit inside of that digital transformation? Because supply chain digital transformation, I mean. Uh, I've talked to a lot of people and a lot of companies. I think they're still not in alignment of the industry in terms of what supply chain means. So, being on the consulting side of end-to-end supply chain and having done the CSCP certification with APIX and being involved with CSCMP, when I think of supply chain, I mean, my mind is very much the seven kind of pillars of supply chain, which I don't remember off the top of my head, but it's like customer service, warehousing and transportation, procurement, purchasing, but kind of all of those things. There are a lot of times where I talk to companies and they are at a maturity phase of their supply chain. If you do 1 to 4, 1 to 5, depending on what maturity phase framework you're using, you have these companies that are in stage 1 or stage 2. And a lot of times when you talk to their supply chain department or even the company, their supply chain department is synonymous to them as warehousing or logistics.
That's right.
Or procurement. Or whereas supply chain is really all of those pieces, plus your sales and marketing, plus your production, plus your manufacturing. So when we say digital transformation of supply chain, cloud-based tools is really just one small piece of how you could really digitalize the entire supply chain. You've got warehouse automated vehicles and robots and things like that, your digital twins. There's so much going on. So, to Martha's point, identify what the digital transformation means for you as a company. But even to that point, where do the cloud-based tools fit into that piece?
Yeah, 100%. I agree with you. And it's funny, a mentor of mine once sat me down. He said he could see that I was struggling in determining what exactly I was responsible for as a supply chain manager. And he said, listen, anything from customer want to customer have is supply chain.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And anything outside those parameters is not. So if you focus on the things that happen between want and have for customer, you'll be fine.
Absolutely.
So your responses actually lead very well into the second question, which is, would you consider this topic more applicable to a digital transformation or a digital evolution?
So I would say that this is part and parcel of the evolution process. So when you think about digitalization, this goes back to late 1950 to the early 1960s is when we moved into the era of digitalization. And during this time is when you see that we were using the internet as a way of being able to transfer the information. And so the initiative right now, I would move it toward transformation and not really evolution, because evolution is a whole concept of being digital. And from the 1950s to 1960s, and then we went into the phase which is the pre-internet bubble era. And I think if you're familiar with digitalization, then you know that Joseph Carl was the founder of cloud computing. And so the cloud computing phase would be between 1999 and 2006. Now we are in a place where we have the SaaS, we have cloud computing, we have the definitions well broken out. And so this would be around 2007, 2008, 2009. And so this would be transformation that is active because we have definitions in place and we have different channels that we're able to connect with companies and connect their customers to the companies. And so the processes emerged to support customers' interactions in 2009, where companies had the ambitions to move quickly, get to market quickly, and being able to maneuver their social and mobile channels so they can access information to be able to support the organizations. And so that's what I would reiterate is from my perspective and my experience, this would be 100% transformation phase that we're in right now, which is part and parcel of the evolution process.
And following up on what Martha said, I think that if, I've never been posed the evolution versus transformation question. So just thinking about it and, kind of thinking about what Martha just stated, I think that if companies were to think about these supply chain digital transformations or even just supply chain business transformations as a whole, with the idea that digital transformation is the tools, whereas the business transformation is also process change management, et cetera. I think that if companies were to look at it from an evolution, not a transformation, in the sense that generally speaking, evolution tends to be a gradual change, whereas transformation is kind of more abrupt. And not to say that it's going to take 60 or 70 years, not like a human evolution or anything like that. But in the sense that, again, these 12 to 16 week timelines are just not realistic. And I know that a lot of the cloud-based software vendors are pushing these very short time to value timelines. But that's what I think companies are missing when they have these conversations with the software vendors is that 12 to 16 weeks, 8 weeks, 10 weeks, 11 weeks, yes, that is the implementation piece or the actual design configuration of the tool itself. But as a company, you also have to think of this gradual change, starting from, again, going back to the very beginning of identifying the process, getting your data cleaned up, getting people ready, identifying a change communication schedule, a cadence, the training afterward, allowing people to grieve the previous process and the previous tool and accept the new tool and the new process. So that evolution mindset of this is going to be a gradual change versus a quick transformation. All right, 12 weeks, our tool is implemented, we should be good to go. No, you're not. It should be this cloud-based tool implementation is one small piece of a gradual, depending on the size of the company and how large the transformation. I mean, I've seen up until like 5-year roadmaps of different moving pieces, et cetera. So when I'm thinking, anywhere from 2 to 5 years, for me, that's an evolution. That's a gradual change. There are pieces to the puzzle that have to be implemented, that have to be followed, where people have to be accountable, where senior leadership has to really drive that messaging and drive that change. And it has to become a part of the culture of the company once you get into these long roadmaps and timelines, because otherwise it's very easy to lose sight of what you're actually trying to accomplish. And it's very easy to fall back into bad habits because these roadmaps and these transformations are not easy. If it were easy, everyone would do it very quickly. But you get into a lot of different stakeholders. Again, thinking of that end-to-end supply chain, everyone has got their what they need to be doing. Everyone has got their constraints. Everyone has got their goals, their objectives, and trying to fit all of that into, the strategic plan for the company also is not easy. There are a lot of moving pieces, a lot of moving parts. So it's definitely for sure a transformation, but thinking of it from an evolution mindset that it is going to be gradual, it's going to be slow, it's not going to happen just because you snap your fingers and want people to start using this new tool. I think that if companies think about it from that perspective, transformation projects might have a lot more success. I mean, the statistics of success in terms of, what companies believe to be a successful implementation or transformation are still relatively low compared to the amount of, I think, buzz we get around these implementations in the supply chain world.
So you make great points there, DC, and I would agree with you that we definitely have to view this from a perspective of it's an evolution, it's gradual, it's going to take time. And the digital part of it is simply, part of the process. And being in line with the fact that the organization has to be very aware of the life cycle of the cloud solutioning. So that is just the basis of how we look at the implementation. It's like, what is the life cycle? What are the steps and processes we need to put in place for the transformation to occur? How often do we evaluate them? How often are they improved? And of course, this has to happen recurrently as you go through the process. And then the questions you have to ask, the challenges, the benefits to your stakeholders they have to face during the cloud computing process. So all these are part and parcel of the evolution as the organization goes through transforming their tools. And then again, of course, depending on where a company is in the with their tool selection, some may be doing a full-blown ground-up transformation. Some may simply be adding functionality. So all those things would be things that will be part of the transformation, but it's still an evolution. So I think we are right on the same line of thinking here, JC.
I don't want to take your job, Brian. I have a question for Martha.
Oh, that's perfectly fine. I hope you do, actually.
So you mentioned, Martha, as companies are starting to look at the different tools and, decide what they're going to use. From your experience, what is and how do I frame this question properly? I don't want to say the biggest mistake, but maybe a misstep in choosing technology. I feel like personally what I've seen is that whoever has the best marketing, whoever is kind of forefront, those become the front runners that the company is considering. But when it really comes down to which tool is right for me at my company, I don't think that a lot of companies really understand the nuances and the differences between the different softwares in order to make the best decision. So sometimes what ends up happening is that one tool is selected, whereas another tool probably would have been better. Have you seen that?
Yes, I have. I have definitely seen companies where they have fallen prey of great marketing, and they have not selected the right IT for the organization. So, I right IT meaning the right technology for the organization. So, I when I work with my stakeholders and work with organizations, I tell them, and this is something you mentioned at the very beginning when we began this conversation, the culture of a company is very important when you're selecting a tool. You need to understand the adoption process. You need to understand how your end users are going to quickly or slowly or maybe never adopt a tool. So if you go in and you buy the most big and flashy solutioning because that's what your vendors have sold you, but you did not take the time to understand your users, you didn't understand what tool you have in place right now, and does it really need you to spend, a couple $1,000,000, or maybe were you better off spending a couple $100,000 on a much not expensive solution that was a better fit for your organization because there's just really slow adoption. And so I will say that I have seen that happen a lot. And that goes back to doing all the groundwork when it comes to understanding your culture, knowing the requirements, knowing the tools that will be best adaptable to your organization. Those are all things that you have to do on the onset before you even approach the vendors in the market to see what's out there. So do the internal work first, and then go to market for the supply chain solution that you're looking to purchase.
Excellent. Those are very salient points. And it goes back to what my dad used to tell me. He would say, Ryan, you can't buy the build before you build the fence.
Exactly.
Otherwise your bill's going to run off.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of companies are buying the bull first.
Yeah, they are. And then so what happens? We end up with shelfware. And I have been in situations with negotiating with vendors where a company is losing so much money because they have spent thousands and thousands and millions of dollars at times to acquire solutionings that do not fit their company, that they have not implemented. And so now they are, they're liable for the subscription fees, and they can't get out of the contracts because it's a 6-year contract, and they have not been able to migrate over to the new solution. So you're now double paying for the existing solution and for the new solutioning. And this is something that you see a lot in organizations that do acquisitions or mergers. That happens a lot if you don't do the due diligence beforehand to understand what you have in-house before you do any integrations and before you go to market. So yeah, to your point, Ryan, don't do that. Understand what you have. Don't buy the bull. Figure out what you have, and then make the purchase.
Absolutely, 100%. And I think with the advent of cloud-based technologies, I think you can kind of stack them on top of each other. And you can take a cloud-based technology that takes your current state of your company and visualizes it or quantifies it, and that allows you better insight into what your next purchase might need to be.
Exactly. And so at this stage, I would say, as an organization, you don't just want to work with your supply chain team, but you want to also involve your finance organization. You want to involve your IT. So all this should be individuals that are part and parcel of the discussions, because they bring that visibility from a finance perspective, from IT perspective, from a supply chain perspective, from a user experience. All those are individuals should be part and parcel of the conversations. So there's alignment across the board, especially because supply chain is enterprise. And if it's enterprise wide, then if you have all that buy-in, then it makes it easier when it comes down to implementation and adoption of the tool.
Fantastic. DC, how can fortifying digital supply chain planning help a company deal with the unprecedented growth we've seen in e-commerce?
I don't think that it's any different from any other company. I mean, or any other industry. So e-commerce is definitely growing, but in terms of cloud-based tools, what I think the best value add is from the tools that I have experience with is the speed. So, of course, it's only as quick as your data is. So, depending on how often you are refreshing the data that's sent to the system. But since it is in the cloud, you essentially access these systems through a browser. So, any data that is sitting in your data warehouse, so your POS data, your shipment data, everything can be seen in the system near real time or real time. And that is not something that I think is unique to e-commerce in terms of it being a benefit. That is beneficial to anyone that has to plan at all, period. In supply chain, if you're planning inventory, if you are planning production, if you are monitoring and trying to do your MRP, your MPS, you're going to need that data. And the cloud-based solution just allows you to get to it quicker and to put all of your external trading partners and internal stakeholders on the same wavelength in terms of a source of truth of data. So you're not doing Excel spreadsheets, you're not doing emails, etc. But again, I don't think that's unique to e-commerce. I think that any industry that is doing production, any industry that has inventory, any industry that that is monitoring shipments and POS data, et cetera, I don't think it's unique to e-commerce.
Great points, Stacey. I agree that it's not just for e-commerce. I think it's across the board when it comes to cloud as a solution to supply chain, whether it's marketing, it's across the board. And when you look at digitalization, I think one of the things that we also see it supports is it gets rid of the silos. In many organizations, you have a lot of silos. And when you introduce this as a method of working, you see the silos begin to break down, where you indicated this elimination of the manual processes, Excel spreadsheets. You have faster access to information real time. But I think it also enables a demand-driven supply chain. So a company is able to easily access and accelerate the production of what they consider to be their best sellers and cut out losses on the product lines that are not doing so well. So you're seeing optimization on the lead times as well for the industry. And so you're getting these benefits when you fortify your digital supply chain planning as an organization. But I think you also are able to use, your basic accounting rules of just-in-time techniques. I think that's fabulous when you are able to do that, because then you are able to improve the cash flow as an organization, and which is always key. Cash is king, right? So you want to know what your bottom line looks like. And so you also have a fast supply, which means that you have less capital that is being tied down in your supply chain. And this is a critical benefit to your supply chain management processes.
Most certainly.
Two snaps and an amen.
Phenomenal. Listen, if we can stay in this alignment, we're all good to go. Okay, last question. We'll start with you, Martha. How can or should a company involve their supply partners as they digitalize their supply chain planning?
So for a company to be successful, at least from my experience and from what I've seen, they have to work very, very closely with the suppliers, because this allows them to create a highly competitive supply chain. So where companies fail to collaborate with their supply partners when they're doing the effort of digitalization, where they don't share information easily, where there's lack of transparency, then you create situation where there is costly inefficiencies. And the whole point of doing digitalization is to get rid of inefficiencies. And you want to avoid what we call the bullwhip effect. The bullwhip effect is what results from having excess inventories. You have a slow response in your supply chain and you have a massive loss of profit. So by being able to have transparency and to have clear communication with your supply partners, then you create that sense of mutual trust between you and your partners. And this allows for the partnerships to develop long term. So as an organization, you want to be long term focused and not short term. So if you orchestrate and you manage the supply partnerships well, the things that happen is you grow your market share. You have your reduction in inventories. And it doesn't matter what industry you're in, whether it's, for example, I'm in the airline industry, you're in IT, you're in finance, all these things apply. And so you also want to see the improvement in delivery service. You also see the quality improving. You see a shorter product development cycle because the company is doing the partnerships with partners that are long-term focused. So what I would tell organizations is that when you have suppliers that you have adversarial relationships with, take a look at your base of suppliers relationships and convert them into partnerships and let them be long-term commitments that would encourage the suppliers to then invest in that relationship with you. And this allows for a joint supply chain where there's a mutual advantage for both the company and the supply partners. So those are things that I would say are key when you think about building on a relationship, and especially with digitalization, because that can take 4, 5, 6, 7 to 10 years. As we talked previously, it's an evolution. And if you have partners that are willing to work with you through that evolution, then you're looking at success on a continual basis and not it being, staggered. It's a continuous basis.
Yeah, I definitely have to echo the trust piece. And I want to emphasize that because I think it's much easier said than done. And it's one of those things where I don't think there is any lack of evidence. There's no lack of experience that shows that strategic trust-based relationships with suppliers are beneficial. So, Martha talked about from her personal experience, but even just in the last couple of weeks, many of the companies that have been able to remain resilient in the pandemic and with all of the closures, et cetera, have cited strong supplier relationships as one of the reasons why they were able to continue to produce or continue to there was not a huge disruption, or there wasn't a huge disruption. There was not as much of a disruption as companies who did not have, those strategic relationships in place. So, as part of your cloud-based or even digital transformation, business transformation, whatever you want to call it, implementations, identifying how to really and truly and authentically build trust between the two trading partners is key. And that's because supply chain doesn't stop in outs, doesn't stop within the enterprise. It is very much, we even call it a value chain now, to where you've got multiple trading partners. And you can even leverage cloud-based tools to do your supply relationship management. So strategic alliances are great. Strategic partnerships are great. But we definitely don't live in a world of naivete. You will have some suppliers that are just transactional suppliers. That does not mean that they should not have the same level of trust created between them. They shouldn't just be written off as like, oh, whatever, this is, another supplier. There are ways to also build trust and long-term relationships with your transactional suppliers as well. So going into any type of cloud-based tool solution that you're going to be considering, you have to absolutely consider the infrastructure that your strategic suppliers have, how these processes are going to affect your strategic suppliers. If you were previously doing this type of email and it's now going to be a file, for whatever reason, that may or may not work from the supplier end. So considering them in the conversations of the process changes that are happening as a result of these tool implementations are key. And even just bringing them to the table and getting their input and their insight, I think is a way to help build that trust. It's telling them that you value them enough to consider how this process is going to affect them. And that could go a long way.
Yeah, yep, I could not echo your sentiments any better. I mean, that's fantastic. I agree with you, DC, that it is key to bring your suppliers to the table. It's funny you're saying that, and I was like, I was thinking to chime in, and then it's like you're reading my mind. But it's very important to have your suppliers at the table with you, especially whether they're strategic or not, depending on what role they play. And to your point, the transactional suppliers, it's easy to say, well, they're transactional, so we don't need to look at them. But end of the day, they are part and parcel of what makes your supply chain successful. And I agree with you that the organizations that have been successful in the pandemic, and I think not just this pandemic, but overall in any crisis that we've faced in the last 20, 30 years, those that have remained resilient, that have been able to continue successfully building onto their business, have been the ones that have some very, very strong partnerships. And you have examples of companies like Toyota that has an incredible partnership with its first-tier suppliers. You have Amazon, a great example as well. You have Southwest Airlines, another good example of companies that have learned how to be partners with their suppliers. So I completely agree with GC there.
Yeah, and to that point, I don't know what your experience was when you were in consulting, Martha, but I'm thinking in the last couple of years, 10 different clients and projects, 9 or 10, just trying to think of a quick list going mentally as we're speaking. I have engaged in one project where the suppliers were at the table. So that's 10%.
And that one more is one more than I've seen.
Yeah.
I would say that the percent is really low. I was going to put it at 20%. In my experience, it would be 20% where the supplier really was at the table, but actually fully at the table to where they could be part and parcel of the conversations, and where their contributions were taken into account and they helped to build the organization strategy. So that is a rarity, and I think it's an opportunity for companies to tap into in order to be resilient, and also to better implement their cloud solutioning and to better run the supply chains. I think it's an opportunity overall.
Amazing. Well, that's it for today. I want to thank both of you, Martha and DC, for taking the time to be with me today on the Owl's Nest podcast. And as a Canadian, I can say that I learned a metric ton of information from both of you. And I hope you'll come back to sit down with me again sometime.
Yes, absolutely. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Thanks for the invite, Ryan.
Yes, echo the sentiments. Thank you so much, Ryan. I learned a lot today, and it was a great conversation. Thank you, DC, for the time, and we look forward to chatting again with you, Ryan. Thank you.
And thanks, Sophie. With such luminaries as Martha and DC alongside me, I can confidently say that hosting this episode was an absolute breeze. I just got out of the way and let the greatness shine through. Again, much appreciation to Martha and DC for taking the time to sit down with me. And big thanks for everyone for listening in. Have a great day, and thanks for being part of the Owl's Nest. Cheers.